Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on Facebook and YouTube this morning. We are continuing our series, I Object, Why Some People Disbelieve. And I've got a special guest with me today to tackle this week's question, Hasn't Science Disproved Christianity? Now, I have introduced him before a few weeks ago in one of our worship videos that you might have been able to catch on Facebook and YouTube. My friend Dr. Justin Bland is joining us this morning, and he is an actual scientist. And so he's going to help us talk a little bit about what is science, what do scientists do, what can they not do, and he'll help us kind of work through some of these questions, and we'll look at what role does science play in helping us understand the world around us. Is it opposed to religious belief, specifically Christian belief? And so I'm excited to introduce to you today, live and not in person, but on Zoom, my good friend, Dr. Justin Bland.
Hey, Bert, thanks for having me. This is great. I always enjoy our conversations, and so this is going to be a good opportunity for us to kind of go back and forth on a very important issue, which is very easily misunderstood. And it's probably misunderstood by, weirdly, most people, and even individuals in my field are, secular individuals are kind of misunderstanding what we're talking about here. So,
religious people and unreligious people
yeah.
kind of struggle with this issue.
Yeah, absolutely, and yet it's really critical. Seems like kind of a simple idea, but it's really critical that we get a good foundation. Are we even talking about the same things? So that's why I really enjoy talking with you. You're coming at things from a different perspective than I, and yet we have the same goal, that Jesus is King, that we are to commission to proclaim His name and spread the kingdom as we go. So this is good. I'm excited about this.
Yeah. Well, Bland, can you tell us just a little about, and also for those of you who may have caught it, we've known each other for 15 years now, and almost always refer to each other just by last names. Yeah. So if I'm not calling Justin boring or unexciting when I refer to him as Bland, that's simply his last name. He is not saying that I'm ice cold because my last name is Burr, although I am pretty chill sometimes.
Ooh.
That was good. And I'm not going to edit that out either. But yeah, Bland, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, where, like, what room you're actually in now, because that has something to do with what you're doing.
Oh,
and
right.
Maybe just briefly the kinds of things that you teach on a regular basis.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at Harding University. I teach in the Department of Exercise and Sports Sciences. So we study this fairly broad concept of science, and we're applying it to sport, to really how the human body responds to exercise. Yeah. And so that's actually quite broad, but it's a good question. How does the human body respond to exercise? Respond to various kinds of stress, exercise being the main stress, and of course then its application specifically to sport. But in my area that I'm responsible for, I'm not really applying it to sport. I'm applying it to the general population in my upper level exercise prescription class. It's exercise prescription in various populations. So we take a look at different diseased populations, and we're wanting to apply exercise as medicine to those different diseased populations. So we're thinking of classic cardiovascular disease, but also metabolic diseases like diabetes and dyslipidemia and Alzheimer's, dementia, those types, multiple sclerosis, those types of things. And so we're applying it to kind of a broad spectrum, so we're going to learn about those things. So that's my upper level.
Sorry, so like you're that class or that series of classes that you teach, you basically help train your students learn how to teach other folks who might be elderly and fell and broke something, or how if they have some other comorbidity like diabetes or if something along those lines. You basically help your students learn how to help these folks exercise and improve their physical bodies. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're taking that's a good summary. We're taking exercise concepts, and we are applying that to disease population. And then we're actually implementing several of those things in parts of our class. So prior to all this COVID-19 stuff, they were in the hospital applying some of these concepts to those in the hospital. They were working with people around the community to prescribe exercise to people around the community. So we're taking fairly high-level concepts and we're trying to get it down to practice. What does it mean practically?
Yeah.
So that's my senior level class. I teach a sophomore, junior level class called Motor Learning, and it's really focused on motor development with two main questions.
Not like an auto diesel tech, right?
Not that type of motor. Good question. Motor as in movement. So it's under the we're studying movement and movement development. So two main questions that we're trying to answer: is movement important, and why do we move the way we do? And we spend the entire semester on those two questions. So it's a lot. It's pretty exciting. So.
Yeah.
And then I teach a wellness class, an introduction to wellness. That's a freshman level class, and that's where I get a broad range of students. Every student has to take it, and I get to really try to address practical meaning of the practical implications to what does it mean to love the Lord with our whole being. And so I have the privilege of bringing that perspective because I teach at this university. What does it mean to love the Lord our God with our whole being, all our heart and soul and strength? Well, that class, wellness, we're looking at the nuts and bolts of what it means to take care of the image of God. And so I absolutely love those classes. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah,
so.
And that wellness class too, like what Bland said, that's a freshman level class. I ended up taking that class when I was a freshman, not with you, because when I was a freshman, I think you were a senior or something.
Like that.
Yeah, so you were still a lowly student.
Right. Yep.
But then I don't remember taking. I enjoyed the class, but I don't remember looking at it from that perspective. And so I think that's one thing that's really valuable for how you approach that class is you look at it from a distinctly Christian perspective of we're going to be living out what it means to be the image of God, and right. So that has implications throughout our whole body. So I think that's a distinctly Christian way to look at it, but I think that's the right way to approach it.
Arguably, it's the most consistent way to look at it.
Within a Christian worldview, certainly, yeah.
Totally. And so that's the wonderful thing. So I'm sitting in my office at Harding. It's a wonderful thing about Christian universities is I get to explore the world using the tools that God has given us to try to understand what it means to love Him with our whole being. Like that's the correct way. That's the only way that it can be consistent. That's the correct way of looking at creation. Yeah. And so that's why these questions that you're addressing is they're very important. They're pertinent to and the implications are pertinent to how we live and how we move.
Yeah, I really like how you talked about how this is the right way, or another way to look at it might be this is the scriptural way to really to observe and talk about what's going on around us, because when we get to our questions here in just a second, we're going to be talking a lot about observation and how we observe things, and how you specifically as a scientist observe things. Just for the sake of some clarity, most of the time when a lot of us think of scientists, we think of chemists or biologists or maybe physicists. And so yesterday when Bland and I were preparing to do this talk today, to record this talk today, I was joking with him. It's like, you don't really have a scientist's office. There aren't any beakers. There aren't any test tubes. Right. Nothing's boiling over or anything. But what you do is very much rooted in those, the findings of those kinds of things. And so yours is really hands-on. Your science, your field of science is very much a hands-on kind of field.
Right. The observations I'm making are not those types of observations. So I did my PhD at Michigan State, and the focus was on pediatric exercise physiology. And so we bring children into the lab and who wanted to come.
Right. The children volunteer.
And their parents.
And with their parents' permission.
Yeah, and we asked them if they're willing to exercise, do different things, and we made measurements, and then we wrote down the measurements. And so those are the types of observations that I made, and you had to be fairly creative in that field because you're limited on the things that you can do.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's. So the question that the author of our book, Rebecca McLaughlin, she writes in this book, Confronting Christianity: 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. The question that she has raised for us this week is: hasn't science disproved Christianity? There's this idea that that science is out to prove and disprove lots of things. That science is, if you talk to some people about it, it seems as if science and religion are kind of diametrically opposed to each other. You either believe in religion or you believe in science. And I don't know if we'll have time to get into this, but the way some people talk about science, it's almost as if science itself is kind of a religious belief system for them. I'm thinking of, these armchair intellectuals like, Steven Pinker and, Neil deGrasse Tyson and those guys that I'm sure that your students at times will run across. But, anyway, I think the trouble that we find is, how do science and religion kind of fit together? And so I think the first question that we could probably ask is, what is science? Like what is science, and what do scientists do, and like how do we make sense out of all this when we talk about scientists and what they say?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we're aware of that. I think that's the first thing that we should be talking about. Let's define our terms, because so many times we are in a conversation with somebody, we have a disagreement, and it only turns out later that we were talking about two different things. And so we actually would agree more, or at least be more willing to listen to the other person if we actually understood what they were saying.
Have you been listening to my conversations with Linnea?
No. So science, just, it's a basic way of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it, it's a systemic approach to solving problems and using observation and experiments. So it's a systematic approach to solving problems, and we're going to be using observation and experience.
And when you say systematic, you mean something like comprehensive, or sort of it tries to be thorough, right?
Yeah, and we also want a system to where we can communicate about that system, where if I do an experiment and you want to see if my results were repeatable, which is really important to science, then you should be able to do the exact same thing and come up with very similar observations, very similar results.
So there needs to be some transparency in your processes and how you observe things, and how you came to the conclusions you did.
Yep. And so that's what science is. And so there's going to be some inherent limitations to that. So we're looking at things. We're observing things. We have a question, maybe we formulate what we think about that question, hypothesis, and then we set up maybe an experiment or just simply observe. Very early studies were just some guy in a lab writing stuff down. This is what I'm observing. Some early studies, at least in my field, was just some guy in the lab, and he was running these different experiments and just writing down what he saw. And from that basis, we were able to build off of that.
So science, because I'm not a scientist, if I were to try to repeat back to you something that it was at least moderately intelligible, science is a comprehensive, or like you said, systematic way of observing and reporting, right?
Right. Yep. Okay. Yep. And we often, most basic is we want to put something to the test. We want to run an experiment and record those results and report on those results, observations.
Yeah. And so I guess that brings us to our next question then. What do scientists do, or what, I guess maybe, what do scientists do, and like what can't they do? Like what are some of those limitations that you just mentioned?
Right. Yeah. So we need to be able to observe whatever we're testing, putting to, and we need to be able to test it. And the thing that we're doing, we also need to be able to repeat it. So we need to be able to observe the thing and then to be able to repeat an experiment. And if we cannot do those things, then it's outside the realm of what science can do. And so we have a tool that is that can be used for specific purposes, but those specific purposes are limited inherently to the things that we can observe and that then we can repeat. And so, there's lots of ways we can go at this point in time. But something I say regularly to people is, I can't prove yesterday happened scientifically because I can't observe it or repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And so scientifically, I don't have any proof that that yesterday even happened. And so I also don't want to undermine what science is and what science can do. I don't want to undermine it. I'm not. But the way people talk about science as if it is the only way to look at everything, that's very, very quickly, if we take that to the very end of its logical conclusion, if we take it all the way, then we know pretty quickly that that's not possible. So there's many things that we know that are real that are not able to be tested by science. And so science does wonderful. It's a wonderful tool. I think it's a wonderful tool created by God for us to learn more about Him. And so we do need to recognize its limitations. And that's what a good scientific paper will have. At the end of the scientific article, scientific paper, it should have its strengths and it should have its limitations. We should know where these limitations are. And that we should be very upfront about that.
There's kind of an old saying where when you talk about like a Swiss Army knife or something like that, you say it's got everything but the kitchen sink. Swiss Army knives are incredible tools. They can do a lot, but they don't have kitchen sinks. They don't have cement mixers.
Sure.
They don't have a lot of other important things, and so that's kind of maybe a good analogy for like half the people in my church, especially these old ladies at church who probably have Swiss Army knives in their purses. Or
that's good. You should. It's a great tool.
But it doesn't have, like you said, the kitchen sink. It's got some limitations. That's really valuable for me as somebody who isn't a scientist, because when I hear people pronounce very confidently, well, science says. I'm stuck because I don't have the tools to contradict that from a scientific perspective, because my training isn't in science; it's in biblical studies. But I also struggle with how to understand. I also struggle because I don't hear a lot of people mention science's limitations, and so it's good to hear that we don't need to, science isn't just, people guessing.
Oh, yeah.
But it also doesn't seem to be absolute truth either. So we can kind of strike that balance somewhere between those two poles. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up. There's a lot to say about this. And I guess maybe the first thing I would address would be what I hear a lot of people say. They'll say something very similar to what you just said. I hear something, a slight variant of that, which is research says that, research says. Well, then you can't say anything.
Studies show.
Studies show. Well, that's true. There may be some observations based on this research. But what they don't say is the research that also shows something else. And so we're going to there's research that says lots of different things, and what you need is you need to be able to find the strongest studies with the greatest amount of confidence. But what you cannot say is that research proves or science proves something. I actually said it earlier out of just to kind of
you were speaking conventionally.
Yeah. And so, but in my class, if you are writing a paper, nobody does this anymore. If you're writing a paper and you use the word prove, I will take points off. Science doesn't prove things. It doesn't. Now, mathematical principles, geometric principles, we have proofs in those things. I don't even know very much about that. That's fine. But science isn't doing proving things. What science is doing is it's making observations and drawing conclusions based on those observations. Now, some observations we can draw more confident conclusions on the results, but we do not have proof. In fact, actually, I was talking to a colleague at a secular institution, and last year, and I don't know where he stands from a religious standpoint, but I don't. I would just call him a secular individual, and we were talking about this idea, and he said, "Oh yeah, the P word. Yeah, we don't use that." And so, like, even he acknowledges, which not even he's a scientist. He knows, as a good scientist knows, that we don't prove things, and so it's a very important aspect of what we do in science. Somehow people have missed this because they're misusing what we're doing. And so, we can talk about a lot of things, but effectively, I hope this isn't too confusing, effectively we're dealing with confidence. How confident am I in my results? And so we use statistical tests, and this is kind of how we have to say our results. I am 95% confident that these results reflect reality. That's kind of how we have to say it, without using specifics.
Yeah.
But we don't say prove, because we cannot do that. That's
right, because there's near infinitely more that you can't observe, and
sure.
that kind of brings us to another question that I wanted to ask. Since science cannot observe the spiritual realm, does that mean there is no spiritual realm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question, and it can be, how do we know, right? And what does this mean? Well, we've already mentioned that very, very rapidly we get outside of the realm of the things that we can test and observe, very, very quickly. And so first, let's recognize the scientific limitation, and use the tool as it's properly designed to be used, right? If you use a tool the wrong way, you're going to get hurt. Someone else is going to get hurt. That's really important. So I posed this question to my sons, who are 7.7 and 5.9 the other day, years old. The 2-year-old wasn't in the room. So I posed this question to them the other day.
I love how precise that is. And I know you have that chart because I've seen it before.
Yeah, of course. I just remind myself every so often. So anyway, I asked this similar type of question. I said, if we can't see something, is it real? And specifically alluding to God, I can't see God. How do I know he's real? And, of course, this is not the first time they've heard these types of concepts. I've been kind of prepping them over the years. I continue to want to try and test them. And so the answer that my 7.7-year-old gave was not original to him, obviously. But I like that he was thinking, and that it's been a long time since I've asked him. His response was, well, what about air? I can't see air. I'm like, yes, that's right. You have just identified something that you can't see, but you know that it's real. And so we talked about the wind, right? It's a wonderful illustration. Simple, but wonderful. I can't see the wind. I can see its effects, but I can't see the wind. And that's really important. And so for them and for me, but for them to equip them to hold on to something that is that's true, that fits into this category, we're giving them a category to work with. And then I asked my 5.9-year-old, love or joy, can you see those things? How do you test those things? I said, you can't, but I know it's real because I've experienced it. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. And so I think that that's really important. let's equip ourselves to be able to handle these very big questions, because someone's going to come at you, and probably already has, with something very, very, very strongly. Oh, it's not. No, can't prove that. Exactly. You can't prove it. Of course. It's just a limitation of science, and it's okay. And so, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, that's man. I love those answers, and we were reviewing some of that stuff yesterday. And as you were talking just now about your 7-year-olds, I don't feel the need to be that specific, but as your 7-year-olds,
Fine.
your 7-year-olds answer about the wind, and how we can't see the wind, but we can see its effects. I know I have mentioned that in classes and in sermons before, specifically referring to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And I think Tim Mackey from the Bible Project likes to riff on this idea of wind, and specifically when they're talking about how the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters in Genesis 1. He tells his colleague there, John, take a deep breath. Okay, now what do you feel? Like I'm about to burst. It's like, yeah, you feel life, breath, power. When you take in a deep breath like that, you feel life and power and energy in a sense. And like that's kind of an interesting analogy that if you can follow that trail down to go from wind and spirit, which are the same word, same word in Hebrew, and it's the same word in Greek. So ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek. Yeah, and I know we've talked about this before, and I've mentioned those words before for my classes here.
And it's the same word in English too. Inspiration.
Oh man, I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Oh man, whew.
Inspiration.
Yeah.
No man, dude, respiratory physiology is nuts, and it starts there, right? Inspiration.
Yeah,
that's great.
I won't give away all of our secret plans, but
Okay.
There are so many cool things that we have talked about where physiological principles, related to how the body functions, have strikingly clear analogies to spiritual principles.
And it's no accident.
Fascinating. So okay. So we've talked about what science is. We've talked about what scientists can do. And we've talked about what they can't do. And for that last question I asked about, since science can observe the spiritual realm, does that mean there is no spiritual realm? You indicated that simply because science cannot observe something, that gives us no indication of that thing's reality or that thing's existence. We just simply can't. Science simply can't test everything. There is something that we touched on yesterday too, when we were preparing for this, and I've mentioned several times when when I've gone through previous chapters in Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. She has noted that there are a lot of these, like I mentioned earlier, these armchair intellectuals and public atheist figure types like Steven Pinker. Sam Harris is one that comes to mind, one of these so-called new atheists. Richard Dawkins as well, another famous or infamous new atheist. These guys will affirm that human beings are simply bags of cells and waste. To put it kind of crudely like that, I think that is actually a quote from Dawkins. These guys will affirm that human beings are essentially bags of cells and waste. But I think many atheists of that ilk will also try to affirm that human life is inherently valuable. I struggle to see how both of those things can be true without some kind of absolute basis, or without some kind of greater reality behind that. And so I guess I would ask you, can science tell us whether or not human life has value, or is there something else we need to look for to recognize that human life has value?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just based on scientific principles alone, it doesn't allow you to draw a conclusion of worth and value. And so what science is doing is it's asking the how question. So how does something work? That's a great question. Let's figure it out. And so as you dive into the how, you start finding tiny more details and looking more how. But it cannot, and it's not designed to, answer the why question. Why are we here? It can't, from a meaning standpoint. It doesn't address the concept of meaning. But here's the thing: communicating. You cannot help but communicate about meaning. So, for example, I was at Michigan State, and just a common, and I was teaching anatomy, and a common way that I'm hearing other people teach anatomy and do different things, individuals who don't have faith background, they would say the purpose of this structure is for this, or this is here because of this. This is the reason that this is here. And I'm saying, no, you can't say that. You cannot use the word purpose. You cannot have any kind of meaningful connotations to something, because you don't have that privilege. If science is your only worldview, you don't have the capacity to address the why question or the meaningful question. What is meaning? Mm-hmm. Now you can be consistent with that if you are a Christian scientist. If you follow that paradigm, you can address meaning and talk about design and purpose and things like that.
And I think it's specifically, or especially design as well. And without getting into, without chasing this trail too much, because design does imply at least a designer.
Certainly.
And we can talk about what that designer is. Like if a Muslim friend of ours might say, the designer is one thing, or a Hindu friend, or somebody else, but a Christian would argue that designer is God the Father or Jesus.
Right. Yeah, and that's topic for another time. Yeah. But the point is that is the implication when you say that this is design. That's the implication. And really you can't. If you've ever talked to someone who's tried to hold very fast just only a scientific perspective, they have to do a whole lot of jumping around to try and communicate even basic ideas. Because even in our language and the way we think about things, meaning is implied, a design is implied. Yeah. And so anyway, we may have chased that a little bit too far, but the point is we cannot, just from a scientific perspective, then assign value to humanity. Yeah. And yet everybody knows it's not true. Everybody knows that we are valuable. That's what this whole craziness around us is about. That humanity have value. Humans have value. Yes, absolutely they do. And we need to uphold that. And we need to support that reality. It just can't do it on the scientific perspective. And yet everybody knows that there's more to the story. There is meaning. Yes, of course there's meaning. There absolutely is. And so, but science can't tell you that. Yeah,
we're getting close to time to where we'll wrap this up. But kind of one last sort of final thread that we could pull on that's related to what you just mentioned is when you try to use science as a way of assigning worth, you quickly find yourself in some potentially quite dangerous territory, because 20th century history has some horrific examples of people who have tried to do that very thing, and what they've done is run with a certain expression of what Darwin observed and the conclusions he came to. And then they, eventually developed what we now know as eugenics. And this is something I've mentioned in a couple of previous classes. People 100 years ago were very strongly advocating for forms of birth control and access to abortions and things like that. And those are not necessarily related, like contraceptives and abortions, like those are not necessarily related. But the reason why people were advocating for those things to be available to the masses is to slow the increase, to flatten the curve, so to speak, of undesirable classes of people. And it was poor people. It was immigrants, and not just immigrants of color. It was like Irish Catholics, but also also immigrants who were not white. Also Black Americans. We fast forward a couple of decades to the 1940s. Well, and I should only have to mention the 1940s before and people start realizing that Hitler and the Nazis ran with the same idea, and so, like I said, we don't have a ton of time to dig into that. But if you take if you take that particular expression of or those if you pull on those things that Darwin observed and the conclusions he came from, you do find yourself in some pretty ugly territory pretty quickly. And so it's nice to hear that based on considering all the good things that science can do, there are plenty of other good things that maybe science can't do, and assigning value to human life seems to be one of those. Do you think that's kind of a fair assessment of all that?
I think so. I think that's very fair. I mean, if we trust in humanity's definition of what is good, then we're going to be in trouble, and that's Genesis 3.
Yeah.
So, we need to trust in the definition that God gave us, which is the image of God. Every person bears the image of God, and we can be consistent with that. With the observations we make as a Christian, I can hold those ideas, and then the scientific inquiry can be consistent with those things. I can hold both at the same time.
Yeah.
Human value and scientific principles. Yeah. And so they're not against each other. I had a colleague, in a similar, asked me, how do I hold together religion and science because of all its contradictions? And I said, what are you talking? What kinds of contradictions are you talking about? And so we got to explain that. And so it's a tool. And Proverbs 25:2 is one of my favorite approaches to this concept. It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search them out.
Yeah.
And when we do observations to search out the things that God has hidden, we are doing a royal thing. We are subduing the earth as He's called us to do as His co-rulers that He's given us. And so science is not bad. You can use it in the wrong way, but it's like any tool. I talk to my kids about this all the time. I show them a knife. This is a tool. It can hurt you if you do it wrong. And then I hold up the phone in the other hand. This is a tool. It can hurt you if you use this wrong. It's a tool. And so science is a good tool, but we must use it responsibly and correctly. And we take it out of context, it can really hurt.
Yeah. The couple of ideas that I want to kind of package it slightly differently, just some things that you touched on, and then we'll wrap up with this kind of last comment. But when you mentioned Genesis 3, that got me thinking about those first 3 chapters of Genesis, where we see how God really instills purpose into creation.
Right. Yep.
And also this idea from Proverbs 25. The whole book of Proverbs is a book of observations. It's observations. It's more like social psychology, more like something like Jonathan Haidt might do. But it's observations.
Yes. Look at the ant. Go observe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
I love it.
Yeah. But what's really I thought about this yesterday, but I didn't have a chance to mention it. Well, I think one of the things that's really fascinating, especially when you get to Genesis the end of Genesis chapter 1 there, you see how God says, go subdue in the sense of govern and
Yeah,
reign,
right.
uh,
Yes.
not as his substitutes, right? It's never, the image there means kind of like commissioned representative. So you are essentially ruling on, in partnership with, or governing in partnership with. And so I think
Yeah.
one helpful way to understand when God says, "Go and govern the earth," I think we could reasonably, faithfully, according to Scripture, understand that as God saying, "Let's go and govern the earth."
Ooh,
Now, the Hebrew is just "go," but I think the point is for him to say to Adam and Eve, "Let's go.
that's I
I'll
love
work.
that.
Let's go and do this." I mean, because God
Because
was there with them in the garden.
yeah, he didn't extract his hand from them. That's a
Yeah,
real. I've never thought. I love that.
yeah.
That's that's a wonderful tool. It's good.
yeah.
I love that.
So, Bland, to wrap us up this morning, does science disprove Christianity? What do you think?
That question's hilarious to me. Disprove. You use the P word. I
Yeah.
mean, not you, but the person asking that question. You use the P word. You can't use that. Like the question is, you can't even address the question because it's not correct. It's not correct. Does science disprove? No, it doesn't. It can't. It's not what it's doing. And so we're talking about two different things, but yet somebody who asked that question, you're going to ask, could ask it so forcefully, and you can say it, they could even make statements, science as Christianity, something like that. But they'll say it with such force and such confidence that it could reel you. But a very simple response, and I would strongly recommend not getting into arguments. Arguments don't help. A very helpful response is just to remind yourself that's not what science does, and this person's hurting in some way. Maybe I should find out, how they're hurting, and I can we're image of God, we're image bearers, and I can carry the name of Yahweh and show them who God is by my actions and the way I communicate with them. And so this conversation was not at all to equip anybody for a fight. Obviously, well, it's obvious to me, but it's to equip us with confidence, the confidence that we have in our belief in God, and to communicate hopefully some inconsistencies in our language when we're talking about science.
Yeah.
So science doesn't disprove Christianity. That's not what it does. And so we can rest assured and rest in confidence that knowing limitations of science is going to open up possibilities for us.
Yeah. As I remember now, I wish I had it pulled up in front of me. I sent you an article a while ago from a professor out at Pepperdine. I think it was from his blog or something like that. And I think he's a Bible professor, but he makes this great point that science has no agenda. Science
Right.
has no political leaning. Science doesn't vote. Science doesn't give money to organizations. Science is simply a tool.
Yes.
For us to observe.
Yes.
And it is a tool with extraordinary benefit and serious limitations. Mm-hmm. And we do a disservice to to ourselves and to each other when we try to use tools like science to in ways that they were never intended to be used.
Right. Yeah.
So, well, Bland, I want to say thank you so much, man. I really enjoyed this talk. I think this was a lot of fun. I hope everybody else really appreciates this as well too. Is there one kind of final thing that you might want to leave us with? One big idea that you might want to kind of wrap us up with while we close here this morning?
Yeah, appreciate you asking me about that. I think something that I'm really trying to impress upon my children is things that we've already mentioned, but that everyone bears the image of God. But I then say right after that, not everybody bears the fruit of the Spirit. Not everyone bears His fruit. And so what I would like to impress upon them is the reality that every person that they see, God loves, and they bear His image. And so we are to treat them with dignity and with respect. But we also need to understand that some people choose not to bear the fruit of the Spirit. And so we need to be aware of that. And so
some people actively reject the Spirit. Yeah,
they do, and are interested in just harming others. And so, those are some big ideas that I'm trying to press upon my children. And as I'm doing that, I'm using scientific principles to give them confidence in what they've been taught, to be sure of what they've been taught, and that's what I'm interested in. Because if they have confidence in the reality of the Creator, Almighty God, and His Son Jesus Christ, who is alive, if they have confidence in that, then they don't have to be afraid, and they don't have to be scared when they come into a conversation with someone who's angry and upset and hurt and attacking Christianity. That's okay. They can listen. And so that's what I'm really interested in. How can I best spread the kingdom of God by loving others and loving God? And one way I can do that is listening. And I can listen with confidence because I'm confident. I'm confident in my belief in the Almighty Creator God, who loves me beyond understanding.
Glenn, I really appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for joining us. Guys, thank you again for joining us on Facebook and YouTube. If you're able to catch this video, we appreciate you liking and sharing these things. We want to be a blessing to as many people as possible. And so if you don't mind, please continue to like and share these videos. We thank y'all so much for joining us this morning. And don't forget that Sunday, June 7th, for worship at 11 a.m., we will be at the building. This class will be online, so will our kids' class. Those classes will be online for the next few weeks. I think maybe around 4 weeks or so before we start to take another look at kind of when we can meet at the building for classes. But anyway, Sunday, June 7th at 11 a.m. for worship at the church building. If you're sick or at risk, we can wait to see you. But anyway, guys, thank y'all so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.